A black farmer stood alone in a room full of rich landowners, their laughter ringing in his ears. But when the bidding war began, the quiet farmer they mocked became the one name they would never forget. The county fair auction hall smelled of dust, stale coffee, and the sharp tang of sawdust tracked in on boots. It was crowded, the air thick with the rumble of voices, boots scuffing against the old wooden floors, and the occasional pop of laughter that rolled like thunder across the room. Fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a pale glow over the pressed jeans and polished boots of the men who leaned against the rails, arms folded, grins easy and confident. And then Thomas stepped in. He paused just inside the doorway, the heavy, creaking door swinging closed behind him as a hush, almost imperceptible, washed over the room. Conversation slowed, a few chuckles died mid-breath, and heads turned, just for a moment, to look at him. Thomas was a tall man, his shoulders broad from years of lifting hay bales and fixing fences under the sun. His skin was deep brown, marked by fine lines at the corners of his eyes, lines earned from squinting into sunlight as he worked rows of earth, alone. His hands were rough, nails dark with soil that no soap could truly wash away. Today they shook slightly as they gripped a small yellowing envelope against his chest. In the back, near the coffee stand, a wealthy landowner with a beer belly straining against a tucked-in flannel shirt turned to his friends, his voice carrying easily over the hum. Didn't know they were letting charity cases in today. Laughter rippled around him, low and mocking, like the rustle of dry grass before a fire catches. Thomas didn't flinch. His eyes, calm and dark, scanned the room, pausing on faces that quickly turned away, on eyes that narrowed in amusement, and on mouths that curled into smirks. He moved forward, his step steady, boots worn but clean, the saws whispering across the wooden floor as he approached the registration table. He set the envelope down carefully, sliding it across to the clerk with a nod. "Thomas Carter," he said, his voice deep, carrying the weight of dust roads and early mornings, of prayers whispered before dawn while kneeling in soil still cool from the night. The clerk raised an eyebrow but said nothing, marking his name before sliding the receipt back. Thomas slipped it into his pocket, his hand brushing against the worn denim where a patch covered a tear from months ago. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, some openly, some stealing glances over shoulders, each one wondering why he was there, because they all knew. This auction wasn't just another county fair event with a handshake deal over cattle or a parcel of feed. This was the bidding for the regional produce contract, a contract so large it would set a farm up for years, guarantee equipment upgrades, pay off loans, maybe even buy more land. For them, it was another notch in their leather belts, another line in the ledger. For Thomas, it was the last chance to save the land his grandfather had bought with calloused hands and dignity in a time when black men owning land meant whispered threats in the dark. The land where Thomas had learned to walk, to plant, to breathe in the smell of rain on warm soil, the place that had cradled every dream he ever had. He flexed his fingers, willing them to stop shaking as he turned to find a seat near the back. Eyes lower into the dirt on his boots. They could laugh. They could point. Thomas would let them, because this wasn't just another auction for him. This was survival. This was legacy. This was a promise to his grandfather that he would not be the man to lose what generations before him had fought to keep. And as the auctioneer stepped up to the microphone, the room buzzed back to life, the sound swallowing Thomas whole. But inside him, a quiet determination burned steady, like a coal that refused to die, no matter how cold the wind blew. Long before Thomas Carter stood in that auction hall, before the laughter of men in pressed jeans and boots tried to shake his resolve, there was a small boy with bare feet pressed into warm soil, standing beside a man who carried the weight of generations in the lines of his hands. Thomas could still smell those mornings, the damp scent of dew rising from the earth as the sun crept over the tree line, the quiet chorus of birds greeting the dawn, and the soft creak of his grandfather's rocking chair on the porch when the work was done. Back then, the world was smaller but heavier, filled with the slow rhythm of a life measured by seasons and rain, by planting and harvest. His grandfather, Elijah Carter, was a tall man with dark skin weathered by sun and wind, his hair gray at the temples. Even then, his back straight despite a lifetime bent over rows of cotton and corn. Elijah had survived the cruel laughter of sharecroppers who never left the land, who worked for a slice of what they sowed, under the watchful eyes of white overseers who controlled the scales and the prices. But Elijah, stubborn and quietly proud, saved every coin he could, tucking them away in the lining of his coat and the cracks of the porch boards, until the day came when he bought a small plot of land. It wasn't much, a few acres of stubborn clay and weeds, but it was theirs. Thomas remembered the day his grandfather pressed a small handful of dirt into his tiny palm. Elijah knelt so their eyes met, his dark, tired eyes fierce under the brim of his worn hat. "Feel that, Tommy?" he said, his voice deep and steady. "This ain't just dirt. This is history. This is freedom. This is promise." Elijah taught him how to listen to the land, to smell the air for rain, to watch the leaves for signs of drought or frost. He showed Thomas how to rotate crops so the soil stayed rich, how to plant marigolds to keep pests away, and how to read the clouds before they split open and poured blessings on the fields. They worked side by side, Elijah humming low spirituals that his own father had sung in the fields, when the world was harsher and hope was a dangerous thing to carry. At night, by the light of a single lantern, Elijah would take out a small, locked wooden box and set it on the table, resting his hand on it like a promise he wasn't ready to break. One day, Elijah told him, "When you need to save this land, you'll open this." Thomas had nodded, not fully understanding, only knowing that whatever was inside was as important as the land itself. Years passed, and Thomas grew tall and strong like his grandfather, but the world changed around them. The banks came with their letters and their threats. Prices rose while the value of their crops fell, and neighbors lost their land, one by one, to men in suits who never touched the soil with bare hands. Now Thomas stood on the same land his grandfather had saved for him, the same land he had promised to protect. But the tractors needed repairs, the seeds needed buying, and the debts crept higher, letters piling up in a drawer he stopped opening. When the county announced the regional produce contract, Thomas knew it was his last chance, the only way to pay off the debts and save the farm. That night, under a sky littered with stars, Thomas sat at the old wooden table, the lantern burning low, and pulled out the small locked box his grandfather had left behind. His rough hands, the same hands that had once clutched fistfuls of dirt, in a child's wonder, trembled as he opened it. Inside lay heirloom seeds wrapped in old cloth, a small, leather-bound ledger filled with notes on soil, rain, and rotations, and a single folded piece of paper that simply read, "Trust the land. It will remember who loves it." Thomas closed his eyes, holding the seeds in his hand, breathing in their scent of earth and memory. Tomorrow he would plant, and the land would answer, because it was not just land. It was history. It was freedom. It was promise, and Thomas would fight for it, no matter how many men laughed. The community hall smelled of coffee, damp wood, and the faint, lingering scent of diesel that clung to the boots of the men who filled the room. They stood in clusters, hats tilted back on their heads, thumbs hooked in belt loops, trading loud stories about harvests and machinery, their laughter rising and falling like the rustle of crows in a dry field. Thomas stepped inside quietly, the door creaking shut behind him, the warmth of the room brushing against the cold that still clung to his worn flannel jacket. He paused, letting his eyes adjust to the bright fluorescent lights flickering overhead, and looked across the room where the landowners stood, their boots clean and shiny, their jackets new and heavy, the names of seed companies and equipment brands stitched neatly on their chests dot in the corner. A group of men laughed as one slapped another on the back, boasting, "Bought the new combine last week. Cuts the harvest time in half. Can't wait to watch it chew through the fields come fall." Another chimed in, "Sprayed twice already, this season pests won't even bother landing. Gonna have yields so high the county will choke on them when they cut the check." They all laughed, loud and unbothered, the sound rolling over to Thomas where he stood, holding a small envelope in his calloused hand. The edges soft from where his thumb had rubbed against it all morning, dot at the front of the room. A folding table was set up where the county officials were collecting names for the bidding on the regional produce contract, the papers neatly stacked. The pens lined up at a row, the promise of hope so close it felt like it burned in Thomas's chest. He stepped forward, boots scuffing against the floor, and a hush rippled through the nearby conversation as heads turned, smirks rising on familiar faces. "Thomas," a voice called from the side, thick with amusement. Thomas turned, meeting the gaze of Bill Hargrave, a tall, broad-shouldered landowner whose family had owned half the valley for generations. His jeans were crisp, his boots polished, a gold watch glinting on his wrist as he crossed his arms, leaning back with a wide grin. "Your tractor's older than you, Thomas," Bill said, laughter spilling into his words as others chuckled behind him. "You gonna haul dirt in a wheelbarrow to meet quota?" Laughter broke out, rolling across the room, some men shaking their heads, others openly grinning, eyes flicking over Thomas's worn clothes and the tired lines on his face. Thomas felt the heat rise in his cheeks, his jaw tightening as he forced a small, tight smile, his eyes steady as they locked with Bill's. "Guess we'll see, won't we?" Thomas said softly, his voice calm but edged with something that made the laughter falter for a heartbeat before it returned, louder this time, as if to drown out the quiet promise in his words. He turned back to the table, sliding the envelope forward to the clerk, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing as he took it, adding it to the stack with the others. Thomas stepped away, moving to the back of the room, ignoring the lingering laughter, the whispers that followed him like shadows. His hand moved to his pocket, fingers brushing against the small wooden box he had placed there, heavy and warm against his side. That morning, before he left, Thomas had opened the box again, tracing the edges of the folded paper, the heirloom, seeds wrapped in old cotton cloth, and the leather-bound ledger filled with his grandfather's careful handwriting notes on soil cycles, pest control using marigolds and ash, the timing of planting by moon phases, and the quiet, patient secrets of a land that would give if treated with respect. They laughed because they didn't understand. They had machines and chemicals. But Thomas had the land. He had the seeds. He had history. As the meeting continued, Thomas stood quietly in the back, the noise of boasts and machinery statistics filling the air, while inside, something steady and unshakable settled in his chest. Narration pauses here, letting viewers wonder, how could these old seeds, this quiet man, possibly stand against the wealth and machines of the industrial farms? But Thomas knew, and soon, so would they. The cold bite of early dawn air stung Thomas's cheeks as he stepped onto the field, the horizon just beginning to bleed orange and pink across the sky. A faint layer of mist hovered low over the ground, clinging to the grass and the rows he had carefully marked with twine the night before. His boots sank into the soft earth, the soil dark beneath his feet, the scent of it rich and deep, carrying the memory of rain and sun, of seasons that had come and gone long before he was born. In his hand, he held the small cotton cloth bundled tightly around the heirloom seeds, their weight light but heavy with promise. The seeds were small, rough in texture, a dull brown that looked unremarkable to most. But to Thomas, they were alive each, one holding the careful breeding and patient tending of generations who had planted them with hope in their hearts. Even when the world outside their fields told them not to hope, he knelt, pressing his fingers into the soil, feeling for its softness, the give of healthy earth that was ready to hold life. The ledger his grandfather had kept lay open on the fence post nearby, pages fluttering in the gentle morning breeze, filled with handwritten notes on when to plant by the moon's phases, how to watch for the signs of frost and drought, and when to rest the land so it could breathe. Thomas began planting the seeds in precise, careful rotations, moving steadily down the rows, pressing each seed into the earth with a prayer under his breath. Instead of chemical sprays, he sprinkled ashes and crushed marigolds along the edges to deter pests, the way his grandfather had taught him. He layered compost rich with kitchen scraps and decayed leaves he had gathered throughout the winter, turning it carefully with his shovel, the scent sharp but full of life. Near the fence, old Miss Lila, a neighbor who had lived down the road since Thomas was a boy, watched from her porch, wrapped in a faded blue shawl. She shook her head slowly, her eyes sad, as she called out in a voice cracked by age and wind, "It's a new world." "Thomas," she said, her words carried softly on the breeze, "you can't win with the old ways." Thomas paused, resting his hand on the soil, looking at her for a long moment. He gave her a small, tired smile, tipping his hat before turning back to his work, his hands moving steadily as he planted. But Miss Lila didn't see what Thomas saw. He saw the birds returning to the field, small sparrows and blackbirds landing on the fence posts, hopping down into the rows to pull worms from the soft earth, their songs bright against the hush of the morning. He saw earthworms in the soil, twisting and burrowing, leaving behind trails that let water sink deep into the ground, keeping it moist even on the hottest days. He felt the texture of the earth changing under his hands, becoming rich and pliable, no longer the hard, pale dirt that cracked under the summer sun, but a living thing that welcomed the seeds, wrapping them gently in promise. As the sun lifted higher, warming his shoulders, Thomas leaned back on his heels, wiping the sweat from his brow, dirt streaking his skin. He looked out over the field, the rows of dark, turned earth stretching out in careful lines, the mist rising and curling into the sky. He pressed his hand to the soil, fingers splayed, the warmth of the sun meeting the coolness of the earth. And he whispered, his voice low but steady, "Help me save you." The wind rustled through the trees at the edge of the field, bending the tall grass, carrying the scent of earth and hope back toward him. And in that quiet moment, Thomas felt the land breathe beneath his hand, as if it had heard him, as if it remembered him, as if it was waiting for him to believe it could still grow life, even when everything else was trying to take it away. It was a warm night, the kind where the air clung to your skin and the moon hung low, a pale lantern over the fields. Thomas sat on his porch, the old wooden boards creaking beneath his weight as he sipped from a chipped mug of coffee gone cold, listening to the crickets and the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. He had spent the day tending the rows, pulling weeds by hand, checking the leaves for signs of pests, and turning the compost under the moonlight, the rich scent of earth sticking to his hands. It was the kind of work that tired the bones but left the spirit calm, a reminder that what was planted with care would grow in its own time. But then, in the deep hush of midnight, the sound came a low rumble, heavy tires crunching over gravel, headlights cutting across the darkness like sharp knives. Thomas set his mug down, his eyes narrowing as he stood, the boards groaning under his boots. He stepped down from the porch, the night air wrapping around him, carrying the scent of warm soil and distant rain. He moved quickly but quietly, cutting across the yard and down the path that led to his fields, his heart thudding a slow, steady rhythm in his chest. At the edge of the field, he stopped, tire tracks, deep and fresh, carved through the soft earth, cutting across the careful rows he had planted just days before. He followed them with his eyes, his breath catching as he saw the dark, crushed leaves, the broken stems. The earth turned and ruined beneath the weight of the heavy trucks. Part of his crop was trampled, the seedlings he had planted with prayer and patience now bent and broken, some torn from the ground completely, left in the dirt to wither under the coming sun. Thomas stood there for a long moment, the night pressing in around him. The moonlight silvering the tears that threatened to fall as he looked over what had been taken from him in the darkness. He knew. There was no proof, but he knew. The laughter in the auction hall, the smirks, the whispers, he knew they didn't want him to have a chance. A black man, working his grandfather's land with heirloom seeds, daring to stand beside them at the auction table, daring to hope. They wanted to break him. Thomas closed his eyes, drawing in a slow breath, letting the anger rise and fall, letting it burn and then settle, leaving behind the steady, quiet determination that had carried his grandfather through harder times than these. He knelt in the dirt, his fingers brushing over the broken plants, feeling the warmth of the earth, the promise that still lived beneath the wounds they had inflicted. His hand slipped into his pocket, pulling out the small cloth bag he had carried since the day he opened the wooden box. Inside were seeds marked in his grandfather's careful handwriting, special, drought heat. He didn't know what made them special, only that his grandfather had once said, "These are for when you need them most, Tommy. They'll remember how to survive." Thomas pressed his hand into the soil, feeling its warmth, its quiet strength. He began to replant, seed by seed, row by row, under the moonlight, his hands moving steadily, the earth closing over the seeds like a promise renewed. As he worked, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees, carrying the scent of rain and the distant call of a night bird. The stars above seemed to burn brighter, watching over him as he whispered to the land, to the seeds, to the memory of his grandfather, "Grow strong, show them who we are." The soil felt alive beneath his hands, the seeds like small hearts, beating quietly in the dark, waiting for dawn. And though the sabotage had tried to break him, Thomas felt a quiet certainty settle in his bones. Stronger than anger, deeper than fear. Because these old methods, these old seeds, they were not relics of the past. They were power. And as he stood at the edge of his field, the moonlight shining on the rows he had replanted, Thomas knew the land would remember him, just as he had always remembered the land. The morning was quiet when she arrived, the mist still lifting off the fields, the air cool with the promise of spring. Thomas was bent over a row of tomatoes, the earth rich and dark under his hands, when he heard the sound of tires on gravel. Slow and cautious, unlike the heavy rumble of the trucks that had come in the night weeks before, he wiped his hands on his pants, standing as the car door opened. A young black woman stepped out, her hair tied back, a clipboard tucked under her arm, boots sturdy but clean. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the fields with practiced precision, but there was something soft in the way she breathed in the air, letting it settle into her like a memory. "Morning," Thomas said, his voice low but polite, the weight of long days in the fields woven into every word. "Morning," she replied, offering a small smile as she stepped closer, her boots sinking just slightly into the soft earth. "Maya Williams, Sustainability Officer for the regional buyers." Thomas nodded, his heart giving a quiet thud. So the inspection had come. She glanced around, taking in the neat rows, the compost piles, the rain barrels lined up like soldiers, catching the last drips from the night's light rain. She crouched, running her fingers through the soil, lifting a handful to her nose, breathing in the scent of earth and life. "It feels alive," she murmured, half to herself, half to the breeze that stirred the leaves. Thomas tilted his head, watching her, unsure what to say. Most inspectors came with pens ready to mark violations, eyes looking for reasons to dismiss small farmers like him, their questions cold, their nods empty. But this woman, Maya, touched the soil with respect, her fingertips brushing over the small green leaves, her eyes softening as she watched a worm twist back into the earth. She stood and walked further into the field, stopping at a row of tomatoes, their skin dark red, the leaves thick and green, rustling softly in the breeze. She picked one carefully, turning it over in her hand before looking back at Thomas. "May I?" she asked. He nodded, folding his arms over his chest, trying to hide the nerves that tightened in his stomach. She took a bite, the skin splitting under her teeth, the juice dripping down her fingers. She closed her eyes, her brows lifting, the taste sinking in. "Oh," she whispered, her eyes opening, shining for a brief moment. This is what food should taste like." Thomas felt something in his chest loosen, a small breath of pride he had held back for too long. "They're heirloom," he said quietly. "Seeds passed down. Soil treated with compost, rotated, no chemicals." Maya nodded, wiping her hand on a cloth she pulled from her pocket, her eyes moving across the field again, seeing not just the plants, but the care in every row, the quiet devotion of a man who had given himself to the land because it was the only way he knew how to live. She spent the morning walking the fields, asking questions that showed she understood soil, the rhythm of planting, the breath of the earth under a farmer's hands. Thomas found himself answering, his voice growing easier, telling her about the rotations, the rain collection, the pest control with marigolds and ash. What Thomas didn't know was that later, in a dusty county office, Maya would pull records from other landowners' shipments, seeing the traces of banned chemicals, the artificial fertilizers used to inflate yields for a contract they were sure they would win. She would see it and remain quiet, for now, her mind turning over the weight of what she had tasted, what she had felt in the soil of Thomas's fields. What Thomas didn't know was that Maya was the daughter of a farmer his grandfather had once helped, a man who lost his land, but whose family remembered the kindness of Elijah Carter, who had shared seeds when their crops failed, who had lifted a child into a wagon and told her, "Someday you'll remember the way the earth feels when it's alive." Maya felt it that day, the soil alive under her feet, the taste of the tomato on her tongue, a reminder of what had been lost and what could still be saved. And as she drove away, she glanced back at Thomas in the rearview mirror, standing in his field, wiping sweat from his brow, unaware that the land he loved had just found him an ally he never knew he had. The morning air was crisp, sweet with the scent of dew and the rich musk of dark soil. The field stretched out like a patchwork quilt under the sunrise, rows of green reaching for the sky, birds darting between the leaves, singing as they flew. Thomas stood at the edge of his field, boots pressed into the earth he had saved, the earth that had saved him. The contract had paid off the debts, repaired the old tractor, and left enough to expand the farm by several acres where weeds once grew wild. Now rows of heirloom vegetables swayed in the morning breeze, but it wasn't just the land that had grown. Young black men and women walked the rows with him now, baskets on their hips, laughter mixing with the birdsong. Some were teenagers who had spent too much time in town with nothing to do. Others were young parents hoping to learn how to grow food for their families. Thomas taught them how to test the soil by feel, how to watch the leaves for signs of drought, how to hear the rain in the air before it fell. He saw them learning as he once had, hands in the soil, eyes wide as earthworms twisted under their fingers, joy breaking across their faces as they tasted tomatoes warm from the sun. They called him Mr. Carter, but sometimes when the breeze was soft and the day long, he could hear Grandpa in the way they laughed, remembering the stories he told of his own grandfather, Elijah, who had once pressed soil into his small hand and told him that this dirt was freedom. Sometimes, as the children of the workers ran barefoot through the fields, playing hide and seek between the rows of corn, Thomas would pause, leaning on his hoe, watching them run. Their laughter was sharp and bright, ringing across the land, filling the spaces where silence once lived. The soil was rich and alive now, dark and soft underfoot, holding the promise of seasons to come. The air was clean, the rain clear, the birds singing with a boldness that spoke of a land in balance. And then, one by one, the men who had once laughed at him came. Their trucks would rumble up the long dirt road, dust clouds rising behind them. And Thomas would see them sitting behind the wheel, hats in hand, eyes lowered, uncertainty in the way they stepped out, glancing across the fields as if they were seeing them for the first time. Bill Hargrave came one afternoon, the same man whose laughter had once cut Thomas like a blade. He stood at the edge of the rows, shifting from foot to foot, clearing his throat. "Thomas," he began, his voice rough, I was wondering if you could show me how you did it." Thomas looked at him for a long moment, the sun warm on his back, the breeze carrying the scent of tomatoes and basil, of marigolds blooming bright at the end of each row. He saw the fear in Bill's eyes, the fear of a world changing too fast, of soil growing tired under chemicals, of profits falling even as fields grew larger. Thomas nodded, gesturing for him to follow, because it wasn't just about the land. It was about teaching others to see it, to respect it, to understand that wealth wasn't measured in dollars alone, but in the taste of a sun-warmed tomato, in the laughter of children running through clean fields, in the soft breath of the earth when it was alive and giving. They laughed at the man who worked with the land, but the earth remembers those who love it. In a world rushing for profit, true wealth belongs to those who grow life, not just money.